somewhere beneath the North Pacific Ocean, in waters so cold and so dark that no sunlight has ever reached it, there is a submarine. It has been there for over 50 years. The men aboard it never came home. And what the governments of two superpowers did next changed the history of espionage forever. March 8, 1968, a routine day at Soviet naval headquarters in Moscow. Officers monitoring communications channels were expecting a scheduled check-in from submarine K-129, a vessel operating somewhere deep in the North Pacific. The signal was supposed to arrive at a precise, predetermined time. Standard protocol, happens every mission. It never came. Controllers tried again and again and again. Static. Just static. At first, nobody panicked. Equipment glitches happen at sea. The ocean does strange things to radio signals. But then one day passed, then two, then a full week. K-129, carrying 98 Soviet sailors, 3 nuclear-tipped ballistic missiles, and enough destructive power to erase multiple American cities, had simply vanished. No distress signal, no wreckage, no survivors, no explanation. The ocean had swallowed it whole. And the world's most dangerous game of hide-and-seek had just begun.
To understand why this missing submarine sent shockwaves from Moscow to Washington, you need to understand what K-129 actually was.
This was 1968. The Cold War wasn't just a political rivalry. It was a daily, invisible war being fought in space, in laboratories, in underground bunkers, and beneath the oceans. The United States and the Soviet Union were locked in what historians call the era of brinkmanship. Both nations armed with enough nuclear weapons to destroy civilization multiple times over. Both sides perpetually one miscalculation away from Armageddon. The most terrifying weapon in this standoff wasn't a missile silo you could see on satellite imagery. It wasn't a bomber you could track on radar. It was a submarine. Silent, patient, invisible. Nuclear submarines could disappear beneath the ocean for months at a time, creep undetected toward enemy coastlines, and launch devastating nuclear strikes with virtually zero warning. There was no defense against something you couldn't find. K-129 was one of the Soviet Union's most capable vessels of this type, a Golf II class submarine that Soviet commanders called their silent killer. Aboard it sat 3 R-21 ballistic missiles, each carrying a 1-megaton nuclear warhead. For context, the atomic bomb dropped on Hiroshima was approximately 15 kilotons. Each of K-129's warheads was over 60 times more powerful. And 3 of those weapons were now sitting at the bottom of the Pacific Ocean. No one knew exactly where. No one knew why the submarine went down. And in the tense, paranoid atmosphere of the Cold War, that uncertainty was almost as dangerous as the weapons themselves. Inside Soviet Naval High Command, the silence from K-129 triggered immediate and classified alarm. Under strict Soviet naval protocol, every submarine at sea was required to transmit regular position reports. These weren't optional. They were ironclad rules. the kind you didn't break without a catastrophic reason. When K129 missed its first check-in, protocol was followed. When it missed its third, the word accident began to circulate in hushed conversations. Soviet leadership faced a nightmare scenario with multiple dimensions. First, 98 of their sailors might be dead. Second, 3 nuclear warheads, some of the Soviet Union's most classified technology, were now unaccounted for. Third, and perhaps most terrifying, what if the Americans had somehow captured the submarine? What if U.S. naval forces had taken those nuclear weapons? These questions, once asked, could not be easily dismissed. The Soviet Navy launched what became the most extensive naval search operation in its history. Dozens of warships and reconnaissance aircraft were deployed across the North Pacific. They swept thousands of square miles of ocean. They searched for weeks. They searched for over a month. They found nothing. Not a life raft, not an oil slick, not a single piece of debris that could confirm what happened. Eventually, exhausted and empty-handed, the Soviet Navy ended its search. K129 and its 98-man crew were officially declared lost. But Moscow had no idea, none at all, that while their ships were searching the Pacific, America was watching every single move they made. Let's go back to March 8, 1968. The exact moment K129 disappeared. While Soviet operators were getting nothing but static on their radio channels, something very different was happening inside a classified American listening network. The United States Navy operated a top-secret underwater acoustic surveillance system called SOSUS, Sound Surveillance System. This network of hydrophones was installed on the ocean floor at strategic locations around the world, designed to detect submarines by recording sound waves traveling through deep ocean water. On March 8th, SOSUS recorded something extraordinary. A sharp, powerful acoustic signature originating from deep within the North Pacific. The sound pattern was consistent with a catastrophic implosion, the signature of a pressurized vessel collapsing at extreme depth. Something had exploded or imploded, or both, several miles beneath the surface of the Pacific Ocean. Then the Soviet search fleets began appearing. American intelligence analysts watched the Soviet ships crisscrossing a specific patch of ocean with increasingly frantic intensity. The pattern was unmistakable. These weren't routine exercises. These were men desperately searching for something they had lost. By cross-referencing the SOSUS acoustic data with the Soviet search patterns, CIA analysts triangulated a probable location for K129 with remarkable precision. The submarine had gone down near the international dateline in the central North Pacific at a depth of approximately 16,000 feet, nearly 5 kilometers below the surface. The CIA now knew something the Soviet Union did not: exactly where their missing submarine was. What came next was either the most audacious intelligence operation in American history or the most insane. Depending on how you look at it, it was both.
In 1968, the CIA launched Operation Sand Dollar, a classified mission to locate K129 using the most advanced deep-sea reconnaissance capabilities America possessed. The Navy deployed the USS Halibut, a specially modified nuclear submarine converted into an underwater spy platform. This wasn't a combat vessel. It was a mobile intelligence laboratory, equipped with advanced sonar, robotic cameras,
and strobe lighting capable of photographing the ocean floor in complete darkness. The halibut spent weeks combing the target area. Thousands of photographs were taken and analyzed around the clock. The process was painstaking, repetitive, and often demoralizing. The ocean floor doesn't cooperate. Visibility is near zero. Then, after more than 20,000 photographs had been taken and analyzed, they found it. The images that came back to CIA analysts were unlike anything anyone in the program had seen before. There, at the bottom of the Pacific Ocean, 16,000 feet down, in crushing darkness and silence, lay the broken hull of K-129. The submarine had fractured. Large sections of twisted steel were scattered across the ocean floor. Internal machinery was visible through the ruptures in the hull. And there, partially intact, still in recognizable form, was what appeared to be one of K-129's nuclear missile sections. The CIA didn't just know where the submarine was. They had photographic evidence of its condition, and they had identified a section of the wreck that, if recovered, might yield Soviet nuclear warheads, cryptographic equipment, code books, sonar technology, and communications hardware. A complete intelligence jackpot. The question was no longer, where is K-129? The question was, can we steal it? Inside CIA headquarters, what happened next reads like a script from a Cold War thriller. Because the plan the agency began developing in 1969 was, by any rational measure, completely insane. They proposed to raise a 1,750-ton section of a shattered Soviet nuclear submarine from 16,000 feet below the ocean surface, all while keeping the entire operation secret from both the Soviet Union and the American public. The technical obstacles were almost incomprehensible. At the time, the deepest object ever successfully retrieved from the ocean floor weighed approximately 50 tons. The CIA wanted to lift something 30 times heavier. No equipment existed to do it. No engineering blueprint had ever been drawn. The pressures involved at 16,000 feet are equivalent to having the entire weight of the atmosphere pressing down, multiplied many times over. The strategic obstacles were equally daunting. If the Soviet Union discovered what America was planning, it would be considered an act of war. If the operation failed part-way and left evidence behind, it could trigger a diplomatic catastrophe. The CIA's own internal estimates gave the operation roughly a 10% chance of success. They decided to do it anyway. When President Nixon approved the operation in early 1969, a project was born that would consume 5 years, nearly $1 billion, and the creative genius of America's most secretive engineers. They called it Project Azorian. And to hide it, they needed the perfect cover story. Howard Hughes was, by 1969, the most famous recluse in America. The billionaire aviator, film producer, and industrialist had spent years cultivating a reputation for eccentric, grandiose ventures that conventional wisdom couldn't explain. He had built experimental aircraft. He had produced controversial Hollywood films. He had acquired entire Las Vegas casinos. When Howard Hughes did something strange, people shrugged and said, "Well, that's just Howard Hughes." The CIA recognized this reputation as the perfect weapon. Through a front company connected to Hughes, the agency began circulating a story. Howard Hughes was funding a revolutionary deep-sea mining operation. The oceans, the cover story explained, contained vast deposits of manganese nodules, mineral-rich formations on the seafloor, worth potentially billions of dollars. Hughes Tool Company was building a specialized ship to harvest these nodules commercially. It was brilliant. It was technically plausible. And Howard Hughes, investing in a wild, ambitious longshot, was entirely consistent with his public image. Scientific papers were published supporting the mining narrative. Industry experts were brought in and given partial truths. Media coverage was carefully cultivated across the global press. The Soviet Union's intelligence services, watching from a distance, saw nothing more threatening than an American billionaire with an appetite for ambitious science projects. Nobody suspected a thing. Now they needed to build the ship that would actually do the job. The Hughes Glomar Explorer was 619 feet long. It weighed approximately 50,000 tons, fully loaded. And it was, beneath its deceptively ordinary exterior, the most sophisticated covert engineering platform ever constructed. Building it required solving problems that had never been solved before, in complete secrecy, without publishing the solutions, without filing accurate patents. The ship's most critical feature was something the public would never be allowed to see: the moon pool. Hidden inside the Glomar Explorer's hull was a massive opening that could be sealed from the ocean beneath, large enough to accommodate an entire submarine section. By performing the entire recovery operation through the bottom of the ship, rather than on its deck, the operation would be invisible to any Soviet satellite passing overhead. From above, the Glomar Explorer would simply look like a ship sitting still on the ocean. Inside the moon pool, engineers built what they called the Clementine, a massive mechanical claw system designed to descend approximately 5 kilometers and grip the broken submarine section. The pipe string itself was an engineering marvel. Thousands of individual steel pipe sections, each carefully lowered and connected, building a chain stretching miles into the ocean. The entire assembly had to maintain precise tension while the ship moved with ocean swells, while deep currents pushed sideways, and while the claw tried to grip an object of enormous, unevenly distributed weight. Nothing like this had ever been attempted. Nobody was certain it would work. The engineers built it anyway. And 5 years after the project began, the Glomar Explorer was ready. June 20th, 1974. The Hughes Glomar Explorer slipped quietly out of port and headed into the Pacific Ocean. On its decks, a crew of approximately 200 people went about the business of appearing to be what they were not. Some were CIA officers, some were Navy specialists, some were civilian contractors told carefully edited versions of the truth. All of them played the role. Deep-sea mining workers, employed by Howard Hughes, heading out to harvest manganese nodules from the ocean floor. The cover had to hold. Soviet intelligence was watching American naval movements continuously. Reconnaissance satellites made regular passes over the Pacific. On July 4, 1974, the Glomar Explorer arrived at the target coordinates. A featureless patch of ocean, indistinguishable from any other. Nothing on the surface to suggest that 5 kilometers directly below, the wreckage of K-129 was waiting. The pipe lowering operation began, section by section, pipe by pipe. The massive string descended toward the ocean floor. This process took days. Engineers monitored every reading obsessively. tension calculations were run and rerun. The ocean, as always, was indifferent to human anxieties. Then, on one of those anonymous days in the middle of the Pacific, the Clementine reached the bottom. The claw extended. The target was below it. Now they had to pick it up.
It was while the Clementine was beginning its delicate work on the ocean floor that the Glomar Explorer's radar showed something deeply unwelcome. Two Soviet vessels, the SB-10, a salvage ship, and the Chazma, a missile-range instrumentation ship, had altered course and were heading directly toward the Glomar Explorer. For the men inside the control room, this was the moment every contingency plan had been designed to address. Soviet ships nearby were not unexpected. The Pacific was a busy ocean. But having them park themselves alongside while the CIA was actively pulling a nuclear submarine off the ocean floor was an entirely different problem. When the Soviet ships pulled alongside and requested radio contact, the Glomar Explorer's crew responded. Calm, practiced, utterly convincing. "We are conducting deep-sea mining operations for Howard Hughes. We are recovering manganese nodules from the ocean floor. This is a commercial scientific project." The Soviet officers studied the ship. They examined its unusual profile, the massive derrick tower, the strange geometry of its hull. They asked questions. The Glomar Explorer's crew answered everything with the smooth confidence of people who had rehearsed for exactly this scenario. Because the Howard Hughes mining cover story had been so thoroughly seeded into global media and scientific literature, it was already familiar to Soviet intelligence. The story checked out. The Soviet ships watched for a while longer. Then they turned and sailed away. The mission continued. Nobody in the control room celebrated. There was still a 5-kilometer pipe string connected to a mechanical claw gripping a shattered Soviet nuclear submarine at the bottom of the ocean. The hard part hadn't even started yet. The recovery of K-129's forward section was among the most technically demanding operations in the history of naval engineering, and it was being conducted in total secrecy, under constant threat of Soviet discovery, with equipment that had never been tested at this scale. The Clementine had wrapped its mechanical arms around the target section. Now the long, agonizing process of extraction began. The pipe string, miles of it, began to retract, section by section, lifting the submarine wreckage from the ocean floor at an almost imperceptibly slow rate. Every variable conspired against them. The submarine section was unevenly weighted, pulling the pipe string at odd angles. Deep ocean currents pushed the assembly sideways. The weight itself, hundreds of tons at the end of a 5-kilometer string, created enormous stresses on the pipe connections. Days passed. The submarine rose. Slowly. Impossibly slowly. But it rose. And then, with K-129's forward section approximately 2/3 of the way to the surface, it happened. A sound. A shudder through the entire ship. Alarms. The Clementine's structural arms, stressed beyond their design tolerance by the uneven weight and the accumulated forces, were failing. One by one, the mechanical supports fractured. And then, in the darkness miles below the surface, the rear section, the heaviest part, the part most likely to contain the nuclear missiles and cryptographic equipment, broke free. It fell back to the ocean floor.
nearly 5 kilometers down. Gone. The remaining fragment, the very forward section of K-129, was all that the damaged Clementine could still hold. Moving with agonizing care, the crew slowly brought it up through the moon pool and into the interior of the Glomar Explorer. What greeted the CIA specialists was a scene of devastation. The metal was twisted and fractured. The section had been crushed by ocean pressures and torn apart by the implosion that had killed K-129 6 years earlier. But even in this partial wreckage, there were things of genuine intelligence value. 2 nuclear torpedoes were recovered, intact enough to provide American weapons analysts with significant technical data about Soviet underwater armament design and warhead construction. Cryptographic equipment fragments were found, potentially yielding information about Soviet communications systems and protocols. Soviet sonar equipment and electronic navigation instruments provided additional technical intelligence about how Soviet submarines operated. And then, the remains of 6 Soviet sailors, men who had died in the implosion of K-129 6 years earlier. Men whose families in the Soviet Union had never been told what happened to them, because the Soviet government had maintained silence about the submarine's fate. The CIA gave them a burial at sea. Officers stood at attention. A naval chaplain presided. The men were lowered back into the Pacific Ocean with full military honors, the same ocean that had claimed them in 1968. The film of that ceremony would not be seen by the outside world for decades. The CIA was not finished. Project Matador, a second recovery attempt aimed at retrieving the section that had fallen back to the ocean floor, including the nuclear missiles, was already in planning. Then someone broke into Howard Hughes's office. In June 1974, a group of burglars broke into Hughes's offices in Los Angeles. Among the stolen documents were files connecting Hughes Tool Company, the CIA, and the deep-sea salvage operation. CIA Director William Colby, upon learning of the breach, immediately began making quiet calls to major American newspapers and broadcasters. The request was extraordinary. He was asking editors to voluntarily suppress a story in the name of national security. Most outlets agreed to hold the story, for a time. But not everyone held. On February 7, 1975, the Los Angeles Times published a report connecting the Hughes operation to a CIA submarine recovery mission. Then, in March 1975, investigative journalist Jack Anderson took the story national and went into full detail. He described the Glomar Explorer, the claw system, the attempt to raise K-129. The cover was blown, completely, irreversibly, and with it, any chance of finishing what Project Azorian had started. The Soviet Union's reaction was swift and furious. Within days of the public disclosures, Soviet naval vessels were repositioned to the K-129 wreck site. Soviet communications made clear any further American activity at that location would be interpreted as a hostile act. The word used was unambiguous: war. Project Matador was canceled permanently. For the CIA, the exposure created a peculiar legal problem. When journalists filed Freedom of Information requests asking whether documents about the operation existed, the agency faced an impossible choice. Confirming the documents existed would confirm the operation. Denying they existed would be an outright lie. CIA Director Colby's response became legendary. "We can neither confirm nor deny." This formulation, now known as the GLOMAR response, became standard practice in intelligence agencies worldwide. Whenever a government wants to acknowledge that a question exists while refusing to answer it, they reach for this construction. It has been cited in court cases, diplomatic exchanges, and legislative hearings for 50 years. A legal doctrine born from the most expensive covert operation in CIA history. K-129's remaining secrets, the nuclear missiles, the code books, the cryptographic systems, remained on the ocean floor where they fell. They are still there today. In 1992, after the Soviet Union collapsed and Russia emerged from its ruins, the United States made a quiet, almost private gesture. They gave Russia the film. The footage of the burial at sea, 6 Soviet sailors given military honors by the people who had tried to steal the submarine they died aboard, was handed over to the Russian government. The submarine's bell, recovered from the wreck, was returned as well. For the families of those 6 men, if any of them were still alive, if any of them ever saw the footage, it was the first and only confirmation of how their loved ones had been treated after death. The broader film record of Project Azorian, hundreds of hours of footage documenting the actual recovery operation, remains classified to this day. We still don't know exactly why K-129 went down. Was it a mechanical failure? An accidental weapons detonation? A confrontation with another vessel? The Soviet government never released its findings. The American government, which possessed evidence from the wreck itself, said nothing. Both nations, for different reasons, found silence more useful than answers. The 92 Soviet sailors whose remains were never recovered are still out there, still 5 kilometers beneath the surface, still in the cold dark. Project Azorian was, depending on your perspective, a failure or a triumph. It failed to retrieve the nuclear missiles that were its primary objective. It succeeded in recovering intelligence of genuine value. It cost nearly $1 billion, took 5 years to build, and ended not with a victory celebration, but with a leak, a cancellation, and a diplomatic incident. But it also proved something nobody had believed possible: that human beings, driven by enough ambition, enough resources, and enough obsession, could reach 5 kilometers into the ocean and drag secrets from the most inaccessible place on Earth. The only question that remains is this: what else is down there that we don't know about? What other secrets is the ocean keeping? And who is trying to steal them right now? Nobody knows. And that is exactly how they want it.